Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out today for our keynote address by Stephen Lewis on disability, disillusion, and self-discovery. My name is Antoni Cimolino. I'm the artistic director of the Stratford Festival, and I am so pleased to see you all come out in such a huge number for this wonderful event today. Thank you. It's been another very special week with all the different forum events that we are holding during this inaugural year of the forum in Stratford. We have over 150 different events that examine the ideas behind the plays in the season. And as many of you will know, I put together the season, I programmed this year to examine the idea of communities. And the reason I did that is because I feel that what happens in a theater, where our hearts feel something and our minds understand something, it brings something together. It brings empathetic understanding to us all. And I feel that is critically important to any community, and especially in a democracy. So I felt in this first season, I wanted to examine this idea. And I wanted to see, as we look at these plays, which have such enormous conflicts in them and see so deeply into human nature, I felt it was an opportunity for us, doing 12 plays all at once as we do, to examine the idea of what happens when a community begins to fall apart. What happens to the people who, for whatever reason, have been put to the margins of a society when that community begins to fall apart? And we're very, very lucky to have Stephen Lewis here today to discuss this issue in its broader context. Stephen, as many of you will know, is not only one of the world's great thinkers, but he's one of the world's great doers. He has made very positive change around the globe. Now, to properly introduce this extraordinary man, we have a very special guest. Every Canadian will know Peter Mansbridge. The Americans are all thinking, what? Why? No, he's also known throughout the globe. But we know him as an extremely respected news source, somebody we've come to trust after decades of anchoring our CBC National News, a person who does extraordinary interviews with some of the great figures in the world. He does it with humor, and he does it very personally, and he does it with an enormous amount of integrity. So the respect we have for Peter Mansbridge is enormous, but it is nowhere greater than in Stratford, Ontario, where he has a home. And where he's known in local hockey arenas as a dad, and where he's known everywhere else as Cynthia Dale's husband. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome Mr. Peter Mansbridge.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, Antoni finally got to the point at the end. There's only one reason I'm here. And that's because I'm Cynthia's husband. And quite frankly, I look forward to getting home later on today where I can say, I was just on the boards at the Avon. It's no big deal. This is a special morning for me to get to introduce Stephen. You already heard what Antoni said about him, and I echo those words. You know, it was about 40 years ago. In fact, I think it was 40 years ago this fall. I was a young reporter based in Winnipeg, Manitoba. But my duties were to cover northwestern Ontario. That part of Ontario is on the same time zone as Manitoba. It's kind of distant from Toronto. And so it was a lot easier to cover it from Winnipeg. And so that was my assignment. In a couple of weeks each month, I'd travel to northwestern Ontario. I'd go from Thunder Bay to Kenora, from Atikokan to Red Lake, and all points in between. It's a beautiful part of the country, as many of you know, especially in the summer. A great spot for tourists, a great spot for relaxing and fishing and living in the great outdoors. The winter's a little more of a challenge, but it's still a pretty exciting place. The problem is it is distant, as I said, from the hub of this province, Toronto, Queen's Park. And so it would be rare to see any of the provincial party leaders in northwestern Ontario. So when I was flipping through the possibilities of stories to come, I was surprised when I noticed that the young leader of the NDP in Ontario, Stephen Lewis, was planning to come to Fort Frances, Ontario. And I thought, well, I got to be there. I've got to see this. And so I went. He was speaking to some of his party's faithful, and it was a challenging time for the Ontario NDP. Stephen was young. He'd gone through one election as leader and had been in a tough one. The party had lost a seat. So in many ways, he was rebuilding the party and rebuilding his image as leader. And to do that, you've got to go everywhere. And so there he was in Fort Frances, meeting with some of his committed supporters and trying to broaden that base. I watched his speech, and I thought, I'd like to know a little more about this gentleman. And so I tracked down where he was staying. And I thought, well, this is going to be tough. I'm going to have to go through that kind of like wall of advisors and spin doctors who will be surrounding the party leader to get through to him, to talk to him. Found the hotel, found out what room he was in, knocked on the door. Door opens. It's not his press secretary. It's not his chief of staff. It's not his executive assistant. It's Stephen Lewis, all by himself. He was traveling the province, riding by riding, by himself. We sat there and talked. I was in my early 20s. And I learned a lot about politics, about the provincial fight, and about a man with passion from that conversation. And so I've followed him ever since. That next election, he doubled the seats for the NDP and moved them into the official opposition role. The next decade, in the 80s, the Conservative Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, picked him as ambassador to the United Nations, where he made a huge impact for this country and for our role in the world. And the UN clearly never wanted to lose him, because in the 90s he worked with the people at UNESCO. He was picked as a special ambassador for the UN on HIV/AIDS, a cause which has been one that he has worked so diligently for ever since. The Stephen Lewis Foundation has challenged leaders and countries and governments to back up their promises on HIV/AIDS with action. Now, through all his various roles, and I could stand here and name many more, he's been honored many, many times. And if I was to list all the honors, we'd have to take a lunch break before we ever got to hear from Stephen. Honorary doctorates by the dozen. Schools named after him. Times top 100 influential people in the world. Think about that. You look at that list: Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama, Stephen Lewis. But of all of those, the one that impresses me the most and the one that I think Canadians are so shy of, is the award his own country has given him. He's a companion of the Order of Canada. It is the highest award that our country can bestow upon one of its citizens. Stephen Lewis is a companion of the Order of Canada. His words and his actions have been an inspiration to all of us. He's helped us to make our countries kinder. He's helped us to make our communities more accommodating. And he's helped us, through those words and actions, try to make ourselves better people. Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome to the stage Stephen Lewis.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thanks to Peter. That was a most extraordinarily generous introduction, and I am beholden yet again to the kindness of spirit and the acumen and intelligence which Peter brings to everything he undertakes. I liked the introduction so much, it occurred to me that we might travel together hereafter. I think that the greatest tribute I can pay to Peter in your presence, in order to demonstrate the solidarity which pulsates through my molecular structure, is simply to take off my tie. It relaxes me greatly. I should also say to Antoni Cimolino, who made such friendly remarks at the outset and made a reference to Peter, that I am known through all of Ontario, much of Canada, and certainly in my own home as Michelle Landsberg's husband. On the face of it, this is an odd topic for me to be addressing. In fact, on the face of it, the topic is impenetrable. Disability I can handle. Disillusion a little more difficult, although as a democratic socialist, I'm intimately familiar with the word. Self-discovery is far too close to the psychological bone. Still, in the interests of Stratford and the extraordinary opportunity to speak from the stage of the Avon Theatre, I'm darn near levitating, I shall persevere. I can't get over the fact that my wife and I watched a most wondrous performance of Othello on this very stage last night. I succumb to this complex subject because of a personal experience that prompts me to speak on disability whenever the opportunity affords. And let me provide, if I may, an anecdotal context. When I was the envoy on HIV/AIDS in Africa from 2001 to 2007, I encountered a daily miasma of agony and grief. The HIV high prevalence countries of Africa were the killing fields of the pandemic. There's no other way to put it. Invariably, as I traveled, I met in country after country with all sectors of civil society, especially the people living with AIDS. On 3 or 4 occasions, I was asked to meet with small groups of disabled persons struggling with or frightened by the prospects of the virus. It was always the same little woeful gathering, always relentlessly depressing. There'd be a representative of the Association of the Blind, a representative of the Association of the Deaf, a representative of those who were wheelchair-bound, each of them accompanied by companions who assisted them. Then they would implore me to do something special about the plight of the disabled in the face of the pandemic. Now let me confess something that haunts me to this day. I failed those people with disabilities. There's no legitimate explanation. In the aftermath, I rationalized my failure as attributable to the carnage that I saw everywhere around me. How could you respond to the pleas, however desperate, of a relatively small handful of people when we were losing an entire generation, literally millions upon millions? There's that old adage about measuring the values of a society by the way in which it treats its most vulnerable. So I say, with pain and mortification, that you might similarly measure the value of individuals. There is absolutely no question that people with disabilities were particularly vulnerable to HIV and AIDS. They were incredibly poor. The inextricable link between poverty and disability is well established. There were no services to which they had access for testing, treatment, or care. They were, despite absurd mythologies to the contrary, sexually active, but with little or no capacity to control the sexual transaction. And most hideous of all, they were subject to chronic sexual violence, frequently from their very own caregivers. Imagine a young woman who is deaf conveying through her male sign language interpreter that it was the interpreter who had raped her. It was, I realized after leaving the job, an appalling situation to which I had paid abjectly insufficient attention. And so a close group of colleagues and I determined to put things right. And you will forgive me if I'm intensely personal in parts of these remarks. Allow me, if you will, then, a slight explanatory digression. When I left the envoy role, I co-founded with my closest working colleague, a woman from Boston, an NGO called AIDS-Free World. We now co-direct it together. Most people in this audience will probably know of the other entity, Peter's made reference to it, to which I'm umbilically attached, my foundation here in Canada, that deals specifically in support of community-based program work on HIV/AIDS in some 15 African countries. AIDS-Free World, on the other hand, is entirely separate and entirely different. It's solely and exclusively engaged in advocacy and beyond African countries. All right, so much for the digression. Using our advantageous advocacy mandate, AIDS-Free World has made it a preoccupation to force issues of disability onto the agenda of the international HIV and AIDS community, and in the process, encourage the coming together of the AIDS and disability establishments. It wasn't easy. The disability establishment was very reluctant to be seen to be consorting with the AIDS establishment because people living with disabilities felt so oppressed, so stigmatized, so overwhelmed by the discrimination and intolerance to which they were regularly subject that they didn't want to have the added dimension of AIDS brought into their arena. And the AIDS establishment felt, look, we have the term people living with HIV. We can live full lives with antiretroviral drugs. Let it not be thought that just because you have HIV/AIDS, you're somehow disabled. So the two establishments were often at loggerheads. At least some of the activists, I don't want to succumb to generalities which are not universally applicable, but certainly some of the activists. To break that impasse, we sponsored major events at the last 3 international AIDS conferences in Mexico City, Vienna, and Washington. These events have ranged from panels to seminars to demonstrations to town hall meetings, culminating in an all-day training session on advocacy in Washington in 2012 for young disability activists from more than 20 countries around the world. It was held on the campus of Gallaudet University, the famous University of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. It was, frankly, amazing, a swirling mixture of sign language interpreters in multiple languages, and the widespread use of Braille, plus ricocheting wheelchairs, a triumph of unlikely collaboration that drafted a 10-point declaration of action, and then moved en masse into the main conference itself, pressing the thousands of delegates to take the conjunction of disability and AIDS seriously. It was no adequate atonement, but at least it reinforced the growing worldwide recognition that a vast community of humankind had been isolated, marginalized, oppressed, and ignored. However, the times, they are a-changing. Witness Stratford Festival's decision to commission and present the play The Thrill by Judith Thompson. It's an extraordinary tour de force about which I'll have more to say during these remarks. But before I get to the play, I want to make the necessary point that in the field of disability, 3 major developments have occurred over the last several years. And however incremental progress has been, these developments must be acknowledged. First, and most important, in 2006, after decades of Herculean struggle led by tenacious and often impoverished disability rights organizations, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a Magna Carta for disability activists. In 2008, it became an instrument of binding international law for the countries that ratify it. As of this date, 133 countries have tendered what are called instruments of ratification, which means, in theory, that the convention has been incorporated into their respective domestic laws. Canada ratified it in 2011. The convention contains all the predictable, ringing rhetoric about the rights of disabled persons. It covers absolutely everything: general principles, obligations, non-discrimination, women, children, awareness raising, accessibility, adequate standards of living, financial transfers, health, education, mobility, community living, freedom from torture and sexual violence. You name it, the convention has a clause. And it's all proclaimed under the rubric of Article 1 entitled Purpose. Let me quote it exactly. The purpose of the present convention is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which, in interaction with various barriers, may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. If I may indulge my peccadillo for precision, and please forgive the details, they can be, I recognize, insufferably boring, but let me disgorge them so you have a full picture. I should add that the convention requires that each ratifying country submit a report within 2 years of ratification indicating compliance or non-compliance with the provisions of the convention. This report goes before an elected committee of experts from 18 countries who dissect the contents, hear from the government involved, and render opinions and recommendations. The recommendations are not binding, but they can be truly embarrassing if they are critical and adverse. In the process, and this is what I love about it, NGOs, non-governmental organizations from the country under scrutiny, can submit what is called a shadow report, and they might also appear before the committee. Their view of progress is always substantially different from that of the government. I get a kick out of the scathing, eviscerating refutations by the more militant NGOs as they comment on governmental claims. It's a delicious panorama of accurate and withering slander. It's the only place where you can speak truth to power without inviting a libel suit. If you will forgive this gauche, entirely inappropriate personal remark, I fantasize about the Canadian Prime Minister being on the receiving end. That's called taking advantage of a friendly audience. But that's not all. Added to the convention itself, there is an optional protocol, and that gives individuals and/or groups a complaint mechanism to pursue. The optional protocol has to be ratified separately But when it is, and a disabled person thinks that a particular clause of the convention is not being honored, and all avenues of recourse have been exhausted, he or she can go before the committee and demand justice. Predictably, fewer governments of the world, including paragons of democratic perfection, have ratified the protocol. Is all of this apparatus necessary? You bet it is. The convention is more often honored in the breach than in the substance thereof. Still, much to my surprise, deeply skeptical as I am about these international covenants, a lot of governments take them seriously and abide by the principles and practice. In some cases, however, the way in which persons with disabilities are dealt with or described is entirely shocking. Take, for example, the immigration acts of the Caribbean countries, Trinidad and Tobago and Belize. Trinidad and Tobago signed the convention back in 2007, which is the penultimate step on the road to ratification. Perhaps stopping just short of ratification allows Section 8 of Trinidad's Immigration Act to read as follows when describing people who are barred from entry into the country. Quote, persons who are idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, persons suffering from dementia and insane persons, and who are likely to be a charge on public funds. And it goes on, persons who are dumb, blind, or otherwise physically defective or physically handicapped, which might endanger their ability to earn a livelihood or render them likely to become charges on public funds. It's a startling descent into medieval language, but Trinidad is not the only linguistic pariah. Belize ratified the convention in June of 2011. Section 5 of its Immigration Act indicates that the following persons are prohibited immigrants, quote, any idiot or any person who is insane or mentally deficient, or any person who is deaf and dumb or deaf and blind or dumb and blind. In the instance of Belize, some administrative potentate is authorized to make an exception if he or she so wishes, but that hardly compensates for the language of the law. Now here's an interesting footnote. Both Trinidad and Belize also ban entry to homosexuals. That ban is being challenged in the courts by our organization, AIDS Free World, and the governments are clearly ready to do battle. If they take a rigid, sclerotic, obdurate stand on homosexuals, you can be sure they'll do the same on persons with disabilities. There is a long and bitter road to travel before you get to simple human decency. Let me add by way of adumbration that there is something you will recall called the Commonwealth. Trinidad and Belize are both members. The Commonwealth pretends to hold human rights paramount. It's a positive fetish of bravado and boasting. But the Commonwealth has never said a word about the indefensible discrimination against people with disabilities contained in the immigration statutes of the two Caribbean countries. Is the Commonwealth aware? It certainly is, and it appears not to give a tinker's damn. Now, sometime back, earlier in these remarks, I indicated that there had been 3 developments worth examining. Let me come to the second. Incredible though it may seem, so little has the world cared about disability that until just 2 years ago, there were almost no statistical data whatsoever on the numbers of disabled persons in the world and no detail whatsoever on policies and programs in individual countries. There was an astonishing vacuum of information. It's hard to imagine that it could happen to any other human category, and it speaks volumes about the fusion of prejudice, intolerance, and indifference that has characterized our collective response. Finally, in 2011, just 2 years ago, the World Health Organization and the World Bank jointly authored the first ever World Report on Disability. To establish a global estimate of disability prevalence, it relied on 2 documents dating back a decade or more, the first being the WHO World Health Survey of 2002 to 2004, and the second being the WHO Global Burden of Disease Study, updated in 2004. The figures are astonishing. The World Report on Disability finds that 15% of the world's population is disabled, amounting to more than 1 billion people. 1 billion. And of those, some 200 million can be seen as severely disabled with great difficulty in functioning. Now, WHO and the World Bank concede that the figures are rough estimates only, and the next set of figures, as they gather more precise data, may well be higher. But the numbers are clearly jolting. I remember being at a roundtable on disability in New York when the figures were released. I was in the midst of veterans in the struggle for disability rights, and they were, to use the phrase of the day, gobsmacked. This is no casual report I'm talking about. It's an omnibus compendium of information on disability, some 350 pages in length. The foreword is written by Stephen Hawking, no less, who brings a determined optimism to the introduction. Thus, he writes, quote, "I have had motor neuron disease for practically all my adult life, yet it has not prevented me from having a prominent career in astrophysics and a happy family life," close quote. Interestingly, that very choice of words resonates with Judith Thomson's The Thrill. Hawkins goes on to write, "We have a moral duty to remove the barriers to participation and to invest sufficient funding and expertise to unlock the vast potential of people with disabilities. Governments throughout the world can no longer overlook the hundreds of millions of people with disabilities who are denied access to health, rehabilitation, support, education, and employment, and never get the chance to shine." And what descriptive terms does the report employ? Quote, "Disability encompasses the child born with a congenital condition, such as cerebral palsy, or the young soldier who loses his leg to a landmine, or the middle-aged woman with severe arthritis, or the older person with dementia, among many others. Health conditions can be visible or invisible, temporary or long-term, static, episodic, or degenerating." We forget the cosmic range of 1 billion. At the opening of each chapter, there are quotes from individuals who contributed to the report. This from Niall. "Can you imagine that you're getting up in the morning with such severe pain which disables you from even moving out from bed? Can you imagine yourself having a pain which even requires you to get assistance to do the very simple day-to-day activities? Can you imagine being fired from your job because you are unable to perform simple job requirements? And finally, can you imagine your little child is crying for a hug and you are unable to hug him due to the pain in your bones and joints?" Or this from Samantha. "My life revolves around my 2 beautiful children. They see me as mummy, not a person in a wheelchair, and do not judge me or our life. This is now changing as my efforts to be part of their life is limited by the physical access of schools, parks, and shops, the attitudes of other parents, and the reality of needing 8 hours of support a day with my personal care. I cannot get into the houses of my children's friends and must wait outside for them to finish playing. I cannot get to all the classrooms at school, so I've not yet met many other parents. I can't get close to the playground in the middle of the park or help out at sporting events my children want to be a part of. Other parents see me as different. I've even had one parent not want my son to play with her son because I could not help with the supervision in her inaccessible house." You know, I'm not really personally sappy or soppy about these things, but I detest with every fiber of my being a society that willfully and knowingly marginalizes and hurts, wounds so many of its citizens. I ask myself time and time again ad nauseum why we can't attend to the open sores of the vulnerable in this world. Why do we have so much money for war, mollifying banks, subsidizing corporate bonuses, and engaging in intellectual pyrotechnics around inequality without ever dealing with the inequality itself? It drives me to distraction. The third factor that I think gives credence to what I'm arguing derives from what are called the Millennium Development Goals, known as the MDGs. You will doubtless know that in the year 2000, the United Nations identified 8 MDGs to be attained by the year 2015. The MDGs were meant to bridge the staggering gaps between the developed and the developing worlds, and fundamentally to bring an end to poverty. The goals, if I may briefly summarize them, were the following: to cut in half the most egregious manifestations of extreme poverty and hunger. In the most recent analysis, which the World Bank did, it redefined extreme poverty as living below $1.25 a day and identified 1.4 billion people in that condition. And if you're living below $2 a day, it identified 3 billion people. To dramatically reduce infant mortality rates. It's important to remember that between 7 and 8 million children under the age of 5 still die every year from entirely preventable diseases, and these are not exotic diseases. It's pneumonia, measles, malnutrition. It's hard for the mind to grasp the utter insanity of losing so many children unnecessarily. To achieve dramatically reduced maternal mortality rates. It's important to point out that for the last 20 to 25 years, we've been losing between 300,000 and 500,000 women in childbirth every year. We know everything there is to know about emergency obstetric intervention. We know about midwives. We know about birth attendants. We know about moving a woman who's in difficulty in labor from a rural hinterland into an urban clinic. But we've never been able significantly to reduce the number. And you have to ask yourself, why? And the fourth goal was to eliminate or to achieve gender equality, to put all eligible students into primary school, to turn back the tide of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, to embrace sustainable development, which allows climate change and global warming to be dealt with, and to fashion a partnership between the haves and the have-nots such that the donor world, read the G8, would not betray its commitments the moment they were made. It's noteworthy that many vital parts of the human condition were left out of the Millennium Development Goals, disability being one of them. Just listen to the way the WHO report succinctly puts it. Disability is not explicitly mentioned in the 8 Millennium Development Goals, or the 21 targets, or the 60 indicators for achieving the goals. Now, I don't want to overstate it, nor behave like a corrosive curmudgeon, but the world got together in 2000 to design plans for human rights, equality, and development, and left out 1 billion people. Nor do the major governments appear to care. The international discussion of the next set of goals is underway, and organizations of the disabled are already fighting an uphill battle to be included in a serious and integral way. The search for the next group of Millennium Development Goals is being led by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the presidents of Liberia and Indonesia. And although they are all honorable people, no doubt, they are moving with a lassitude and incrementalism which defies explanation. I have to say that the pattern is so bloody aggravating. I've been pretty good, you will concede, so far in this presentation. But I beg you to permit me one rant, one prolonged spasm of rage, and make connections that on the surface are not immediately apparent. Disability wasn't the only dimension left out of the MDGs. There wasn't a word on sexual and reproductive rights. How is that possible in the year 2000? Who were these oafs, these misogynist political jerks in governments who were so afraid of possible talk of family planning or abortion that they were willing to ignore half the world's population? And in a similar vein, the so-called goal of gender equality was a complete farce that really rankles more than any other. It was absolutely unforgivable and incomparably stupid. Gender equality was measured, to all intents and purposes, by the target of having an equal number of boys and girls in school. That was the definition of gender equality. Where was the entire panoply of women's issues, from sexual trafficking to female genital mutilation, to forced sterilization, to child marriage, to sexual violence and rape, to the absence of property laws, to the absence of inheritance laws, to the absence of economic empowerment or political representation? It all boiled down for the international community to boys and girls in school. That then became the definitive crux of gender equality. I think that in part explains our appalling failures in the realm of sexual violence, which is so much a centerpiece of international discussions today. I think I mentioned my wife and I saw Othello here last night, and at the intermission I bumped into Chris Abrahams, the remarkable director of the play, and in our brief conversation he was saying that the play, as he realized in directing it, was such a catalog of sexual violence, and it got worse and worse as the play developed. How well I remember the essay Eve Ensler, author of the Vagina Monologues, wrote in 2007 after having visited the eastern region of the Congo. It began, quote, "I have just returned from hell. I am trying for the life of me to figure out how to communicate what I have seen and heard in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. How do I convey these stories of atrocities without your shutting down, quickly turning the page, or feeling too disturbed? How do I tell you of girls as young as 9 raped by gangs of soldiers, of women whose insides were blown apart by rifle blasts and whose bodies now leak uncontrollable streams of urine and feces? Nothing I have ever experienced felt as ghastly, terrifying, and complete as the sexual torture and attempted destruction of the female species here. It is not too strong to call this a femicide." Eve Ensler goes on to describe individual cases from the interviews she conducted, but I do not have the courage to read them to you. But the women of the Congo, they have a courage non pareil. I remember I was thinking about this as I was drafting my remarks. I had the privilege a couple of years ago of being in the eastern region of the Congo, attending the opening of something called the City of Joy. City of Joy was built by the NGO that Eve Ensler oversees called VIDE. It was built largely through the work of women themselves, and it was built adjacent to the Panzi Hospital in the regional capital of Bukavu, where a remarkable surgeon named Dr. Denis Mukwege oversees the efforts on the part of several surgeons to surgically repair the reproductive tracts of the women. And at the opening of the City of Joy, I was very lucky. I was there with my son and daughter-in-law. There were 3,000 women gathered under a vast tent, and every single one of them had been brutally raped. And with that enormous internal strength, they danced and they sang and they demonstrated in every fiber of their being the determination to overcome the unendurable horror to which they'd been subject. And at one point during the proceedings, one young woman of the age of about 17 or 18 took the microphone at the stage at the head of the tent, and she looked out at the governor of the region, who was sitting with all of his male satraps and sycophants in the front row. And she said to him, God, she was so brave and so compelling. She said to him, Mr. Governor, you know why this is happening. If it was happening to men, it would have ended 15 years ago. And everyone in that vast realm of solidarity understood exactly what was being said. More than 500,000 women have been raped in the Congo since the Rwandan genocide in 1994. And it goes on and on without any apparent solution. But the Congo, as the worst place in the world for women, is part of a pattern that extends to Syria, Egypt, Kenya, Liberia, Afghanistan, to the savage, politically orchestrated rapes unleashed by President Mugabe of Zimbabwe in 2008 against women solely because they supported the opposition party, or the ghastly rape in India, or the ghastly rapes that followed it in South Africa, or the raping around the Barrick gold mines in Tanzania and Papua New Guinea, or for that matter, the rape by the high school footballers in Steubenville, or the rapes in the American military, rape in conflict as a strategy of war, political rape, intimate partner rape, marital rape, gang rape. It's a ubiquitous international contagion, and the world is barely dealing with it, and any dealings there are speak to helping and healing the women after the rapes have occurred. In the words of a strong feminist friend, it's a classic mopping up operation. There's almost nothing taking place to prevent rape and sexual violence. Yes, there are Security Council resolutions that could fill a warehouse of filing cabinets, but those resolutions are pathetic and insulting. No, they're actually degrading in their impotence, and they speak volumes about the wanton indifference to the rights of women. And the same destructive sexism applies to HIV and AIDS. There's no denying that we've made considerable progress on a number of fronts, but I can say with some authority that the most neglected part of the entire response has been the response to women. In sub-Saharan Africa, nearly 60% of those who are infected are women and girls. And there are 23 or 24 million people who are infected, so you can imagine the numbers. And in the age group 15 to 24, the level of infection amongst women and girls is more than twice that of men and boys. Further, we now have literally millions of grandmothers, many of them living with the virus, many of them impoverished, somehow looking after the children orphaned by AIDS. There are some 14 or 15 million children in that category. In large measure, the grandmothers are ignored by the international community, and there's no disguising the fact that that's another example of pervasive discrimination against women. And if you'll forgive this personal aside, my foundation in Canada is very, very deeply invested in supporting the grandmothers of Africa and building a bridge with the grandmothers of Canada. And we're so concerned about what's happening. It's as though orphans who are orphaned as a result of AIDS had fallen off the international agenda. They're no longer included in the major reports. God alone knows what's happening to them or to the children they are now having without any parental experience whatsoever. And so, because of the excruciating predicament of the grandmothers, just to let you know, because in a way it's quite fascinating, the foundation is holding a tribunal in Vancouver on September the 7th, where we're bringing a number of grandmothers from Africa to give testimony and evidence of the oppressive nature of their lives and what they're struggling with. And they will do it before a remarkable panel of so-called judges, one of whom you'll be pleased to know is Gloria Steinem. And they will attempt to create, in the conjunction of testimony and judicial responses, a sense for Canadians of what we're still struggling with in the midst of the pandemic. I mean, there are roughly 9 million people now in treatment, but there are 34 million people living with the virus. And we have a very long road to go before we finally expunge that terror from the planet. You would think that after 32 years of the pandemic and more than 30 million deaths, the focus on women as a high-risk group would be all-consuming. It's just not so. Alas, the perfervid indifference to women applies to governments and UN agencies and funding organizations alike. It's all so unforgivably cavalier. UNICEF failed lamentably as an organization in dealing with what we call vertical transmission, the transmission of the virus from the mother to the child during pregnancy, birth, and breastfeeding, with very, very little attention whatsoever being paid to the continuing life of the mother. UNAIDS, which has primary responsibility to orchestrate and coordinate activities against the pandemic within the United Nations system, has become enamored of public relations in a way that is frankly embarrassing. WHO is lamentably cautious in what it encourages countries to do. The great funding agencies, the Presidential Initiative in the United States called PEPFAR, and the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, created by the world countries, they're suffering significant cutbacks in funding. PEPFAR has had a cutback of $500 million. It's hard to believe that that has happened under the administration of President Obama. And the Global Fund has had a change of leadership and is wrestling with a new formula and is struggling with an absence of dollars. The most recent UNAIDS report showed that we are now $7 billion short of what we annually need to deal with the pandemic. And frankly, when you compare it with the amount of money we're using on implausible acts of human destruction, it amounts to very little indeed. There is neither revelation nor profundity. In fact, banality would be more like it, in saying that there's something deeply, mercilessly wrong in the way the world treats women. Gender equality is the single most important struggle on the planet and the most difficulty. And let me say, patriarchy is a crime against humanity. Now, you may think I've wandered far afield, I grant you, perhaps a touch, but not entirely. It's no accident that in the discussion of disability, there's always a special section on disability and women, a recognition that the women carry a double and triple vulnerability. And when you think of it, if you give disability the broadest of definitions, that it encompasses discussions of equality and human rights, and as the convention says, fundamental freedoms. And equality speaks to class and race and poverty and all the gradations of the human condition that make people with disabilities hugely and disproportionately more vulnerable. In many ways, disability serves as a universal template. But in this lecture, disability triggers disillusion, and so I must now deal with that phenomenon. I may say that in all my adult life, this is probably the first time I've paid attention to an assigned topic. And as you see, my attention span is not impressive. The matter of disillusion is a central feature of Judith Thomson's quite wonderful play, The Thrill. I've not seen it performed. I must do so before the season is out. I have, however, read it and loved it and commend the play to all of you. The playwright's note as the preamble to the text says that the play was inspired by the late disability activist Harriet McBride Johnson and makes particular reference to an article she wrote for the New York Times Magazine called Unspeakable Conversations. So I went to the internet and found Unspeakable Conversations, and indeed it's true. The play is modeled strongly on the article, albeit with all the creative adornments that lifts a play from the pages to the heart. Harriet Johnson's bracing article begins this way, quote, "He insists he doesn't want to kill me." She is, by the way, referring to a leading academic philosopher who not only supports the right to die movement, but also the right of parents to kill a baby after it is born if the baby is severely disabled. He simply thinks, she goes on to write, "It would have been better, all things considered, to have given my parents the option of killing the baby I once was, and to let other parents kill similar babies as they come along, and thereby avoid the suffering that comes with lives like mine and satisfy the reasonable preferences of parents for a different kind of child. It has nothing to do with me," he said. "I should not feel threatened." In order to understand more clearly, let me give you Harriet's description of herself in the New York Times article. Quote, "It's not that I'm ugly. It's more that most people don't know how to look at me. The sight of me is routinely discombobulating. The power wheelchair is enough to inspire gawking, but that's the least of it. Much more impressive is the impact on my body of more than 4 decades of a muscle-wasting disease. At this stage of my life, I'm Karen Carpenter thin, flesh mostly vanished, a jumble of bones in a floppy bag of skin. When in childhood my muscles got too weak to hold up my spine, I tried a brace for a while, but fortunately a skittish anesthesiologist said no to fusions, plates, and pins, all the apparatus that might have kept me straight. At 15, I threw away the back brace and let my spine reshape itself into a deep, twisty S-curve. Now my right side is 2 deep canyons. To keep myself upright, I lean forward, rest my rib cage on my lap, plant my elbows beside my knees. Since my backbone found its own natural shape, I've been entirely comfortable in my skin. I am the first generation to survive to such decrepitude. Because antibiotics were available, we didn't die from the childhood pneumonia that often comes with weakened respiratory systems. I guess it's natural enough that most people don't know what to make of us, close quote. It's such a brilliant piece of writing, inspiring Judith Thomson to even greater brilliance in another artistic form. Both the essay and the play use the artful conceit of a female protagonist who is profoundly disabled and a male antagonist who is a man of letters and fame. The woman represents the not dead yet movement. She's Alora in the play. And the man is an apostle of the right to die philosophy, Julian in the play. They do sensational and often gruesomely hilarious verbal battle. And Julian, despite his convictions, falls in love with Alora, and it is requited. In the end, in one of those gripping life turnabouts, Alora, crown jewel of the not dead yet movement, attempts to persuade Julian, crown jewel of assisted suicide or disability-based killing, to help her bring a finale to her life. I won't spoil it for you. To put it mildly, the final twists are inspired. In the course of the play and a close reading of the essay, the meaning of disillusion emerges in many garbs. There's the disillusion of having the world against you simply because you're disabled. There's the disillusion of being unable to persuade the world at large that despite disability, life is full and bursting. There's the disillusion of dealing with the same arguments repetitively to the point of self-immolation. Why should the state allow abortion but not infanticide? Why should it be allowed to take people off life support but mercy killing is not allowed? Why should so many disabled people be shoveled into the gulag? The gulag, asks Julian. Institutions, responds Alora, where they are infantilized, disrespected, left in bathtubs to drown, left in hallways for hours at a time, pissing themselves, drooling, told what to eat, when to eat, left to choke, told when to sleep, when to shit, spoken to as if they were animals, tackled and tied up when they scream for help. If the government directed those funds to home care, their lives could be as fulfilling as mine is. They could do anything. Some of the lovely, smart, vibrant Crips I went to Camp fucking Courage with are in those dungeons now. And they are crying for help. Those institutions are jails where they are sent for the crime of being disabled. Julian. But surely to God, not all institutions are like that, Alora. There are government regulations and inspectors, and Alora, are you really as stupid as you are pretending to be? And then there's a visceral, brutal exchange over whether or not the audience would want to terminate a pregnancy if they knew the baby would turn out as Alora has turned out. And the audience overwhelmingly votes in favor of termination, to which Alora responds, most of you, almost all of you, would terminate rather than look at my gimpy face in the cradle. In fact, there are only 1, 2, 3 of you who would choose to be my mother. Very well, very well. Me and my people, we have a hell of a lot of work to do. I love my life, people. Do you not believe me? Do you think I'm lying to you? Let me ask you, what are you afraid of? What exactly are you so fucking afraid of? I implore you as you walk into the night, as you look up at the dark sky, to ask yourself, what am I so afraid of? And in writing that quite brilliant exchange into the play, Judith Thomson plumbs the depths, not just of disillusionment, but of the third anchor of this lecture, self-discovery. That's the toughest part. For a disabled person to triumphantly achieve his or her possibilities in life, regardless adversity, is glorious. It must be one of the most uplifting moments imaginable. Permit me one partisan anecdote. In the international realm of disability, Canada has had a remarkably talented player. His name is Steve Esty, and he became deaf later in life. Working with organizations in the field of disability, he's been one of the strongest proponents for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability and played a key role in bringing the convention to fruition. I've worked with Steve for several years, and he has my unalloyed admiration. Steve is still learning sign language, and he doesn't read lips easily. He uses something called CART, that stands for Communication Access Real-Time Translation. A person who operates CART in the manner of a court stenographer provides word-for-word speech-to-text interpreting service for people like Steve. It means he's accompanied by an assistant and a computer screen wherever he goes. It isn't easy, but he is indomitable. And when I think of people subduing adversity and loving self-discovery, I think of Steve last Monday night when he won a hard-fought nomination in the riding of Dartmouth North in Halifax as a candidate in the upcoming provincial election. He'll probably win, and he'll be a superlative member of the legislature, demonstrating that in his case, disability is neither a bar to eloquence or intelligence. Because I don't want to drive partisanship through the wall, you'll have to guess which political party he's representing. But as difficult, though at times exhilarating, as self-discovery can be for the disabled, it's equally difficult for the rest of us, if for rather different reasons. This is not meant to be a confessional, but I'm old enough now to see the virtues of honesty. I think I failed the people with disabilities a decade ago because I was uncomfortable. I didn't know whether or not to take an arm and guide someone with a white cane. I didn't know whether to speak directly to the person who was deaf or to speak to the interpreter. I didn't know whether to extend a handshake to someone in a wheelchair when they would obviously find it difficult to reciprocate. I was strangled by uncertainty and my own embarrassment. I think I've overcome all of that in the experience of the last few years, but I'm mortified by how long it took. Self-discovery isn't easy. Right at the very, very end of the thrill, Alora, in the final throes of life, is dancing with her caregiver, a fellow named Francis. She says, "Do you believe in heaven?" "I don't, not in the sky. Heaven is right here, isn't it? And it's dirty and it's awful." Francis says, "And don't forget, tedious." Alora, "But it's ours." Francis, "Yes, it is." Alora, "Right here, right now, at this moment in time." There are, right now, huge numbers of issues in the quest for social justice. We're whipsawed among poverty and climate change and disease and conflict. It's endless. I noticed in this morning's papers that 82 children who had been forced to become child soldiers have just been rescued in the Congo. I think of Doctors Without Borders who just had to pull out of Somalia, the humanitarian imperative left in tatters. I believe in the audience today is Dave Toyson, head of World Vision Canada, who wrestles with these assaults to the human condition day in and day out. But in this place, on this day, as Alora would put it, at this moment in time, I beg you to spare some energy, some intellect, some analysis, some vision for the fight for the human rights of disabled persons. I haven't found it easy, as you undoubtedly discerned, to tie the three component themes together. But in truth, they are inseparable. By way of analogy, it's impossible to have a deep feminist understanding without dealing with race and class and poverty and equality, all the indelible parts of the feminist analysis. Well, so too disability, especially self-discovery. Not just the self-discovery of a disabled person or an observer, but a societal self-discovery, changing attitudes and values and laws. I was discussing this with Michelle just this morning, and her grasp of these issues is so much more insightful than mine. And she was saying that a societal shift occurs when we probe within ourselves our own limitations, our own fears, our own prejudices, our own intolerance, and then try to make a link to all that is best and most positive in the hearts and souls of others. That's the ultimate self-discovery that makes a society tick. And when it is achieved, it leads to a better world for all. Thank you for having me. Thank you. You will not take it amiss, I hope, if I say that I understand why you would wish to stand. As I inch into my dotage, I'm in a terrible Castro-like phase. I'm loving this platform, and you can go out and have a bite to eat and return and be confident that I'll still be speaking. I gather that there are microphones in the aisles, I think, or available, and I judge as well that we have some time for questions, and I would be happy to take a crack at them if I can. Kira, it's right at the front, eh? They're one on each side of the stage, and if you could come to the front to ask you.
Technical question for those who won't be in Vancouver. Is there a link to your Grandmothers to Grandmothers?
Yes, the Grandmothers Tribunal will be streamed, and there will be a link which we will try to convey to as many groups as possible. If you're part of or know any grandmothers group in the country, and there are some 260 of them, then you can find it. There are grandmothers in the audience. I have learned as a matter of self-preservation always to acknowledge the grandmothers in the audience.
And secondly, could I acknowledge the grandfathers?
Yes, I have no objection to grandfathers whatsoever. I am actually one of them.
As am I. So my second question deals with my grandson.
Yes.
Who is 10.
Yes.
And is involved with the Kielburger Me-to-We, and is just in the process of raising, I believe it's $8,500, with which he then, in about 16 months, will go to Kenya to help construct a school. That deals with the physicality of construction. You're speaking here about the conceptualization of a change of attitude which must come from the young. How do I, as a grandfather, undertake to educate my Canadian boy living in Guelph of the true implications of what he's physically going to assist in building that will take place inside that building? How can I begin now, as a grandfather, the educational process that will enable him, when he arrives in Kenya, to understand the true implications of what he's participating in?
You're not suggesting that living in Guelph disadvantages you? No, okay. I wasn't sure why you'd thrown that in. You know, as I'm learning with grandsons, one of whom is 8, one of whom is 11, they're the boys of our older daughter, Ilana, who runs the foundation and whose inspired and remarkable genius of insight brought the grandmother's question not only to the foundation, but actually to the attention of the international community. The boys, are amazing in what they grasp from the internet and from the school about issues. And they are deeply interested when you sit down and engage with them. And one of the advantages of Kenya, and some might regard it as a disadvantage, but one of the advantages of Kenya is that it is always alive with disputation and activity. And it's not just the violence that followed the Kenyan elections of 2007, 2008, or that the president and vice president are presently under indictment by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. That's a bit much. But it's also the fact that you have the biggest slum in all of East Africa called Kibera, 1 million people living in conditions which are indescribable, and when seen visually and talked about, really strike a chord in the heart and the mind of a child who worries about that kind of palpable inequality. Kenya has it has wonderful ethnic groups which bestir interest, the cultural backgrounds, the patterns. It has some remarkable women members of the parliament and some who are cabinet ministers, so you get a gender balance in the country. It's throbbing with economic activity, even though there's a lot of hardship. It has a huge refugee camp dealing with Somali refugees. It has so many things going on at the same time, including the Maasai ethnic group, which is so fascinating, that I think your young 10-year-old grandson can learn a great deal prior to going with Craig and his friends to build the school. There is another organization called Right to Play, headed by a Norwegian speed skater who won a gold medal 4 times in a row, Johan Kaas. And Right to Play is doing some lovely things with young kids around soccer and HIV, both in the Maasai region and in and around Nairobi. So I think the doors can open for your grandson. Can I go to this? Is there no one, or is there some? Oh, there you are. I'll go back and forth, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. In our comfortable, developed worlds, it seems that our educational institutions are coming to serve a purpose nothing beyond maintaining our comfort and entering us in some way into the machinations of economic theory and structure, with less than lip service to sustaining the human spirit, our humanity, our sense of equity. Could you comment on whether there might be room to alter how we approach education in our developed world, to have regard for all others rather than just ourselves?
That's an extremely good question, and I think you speak to a yearning that is probably felt by large numbers in the audience. And I mean, an education system cannot operate, certainly does not operate, independent of the values of the system as a whole. Education systems are directed by governments, and inevitably the governments have policies and practices which suffuse the system and for which educators must abide. So one of the things one has to do, I think, is help to change the political construct of a society, whether it is of Ontario or of Canada. And in the process, educators pick up the messages as the priorities change and shift. And you, I think, try to align ourselves, with those social justice movements seeking progressive social change, whether it's around the tar sands or whether it's around Aboriginal rights. And in the process of participation, we begin to influence the way in which the society and the schools will operate. It helps greatly if you have a good school trustee. It helps greatly if you don't have the mayor of Toronto. It helps greatly. I'll undoubtedly pay a price for that, but it's so delicious I couldn't avoid it. And I think that it's very useful to have new voices and new impulses emerging in a society. But it takes a tremendous amount of time, and you cannot, it's very, very hard to change individual schools or individual boards now, given the prevailing gestalt, the prevailing sense of values that neoliberal capitalism provides. I'm sharing the conspiracy theory with you because I sensed it as you were at the microphone. Yes.
Excuse me for my nerves, and I feel very humbled to be in front of you here.
Oh, please don't.
I'm one of those people that believes in the grassroots and working from home, and have a great sense of respect for those of you that hit the public forum as you have. I work in the public forum. I'm paid by the government. In my workplace, I'm lucky if women are 20% of the total workforce. My job is all over the world, and it exists all over the world. There are rules about what I can and cannot say, and there are rules about what I'm allowed to do. I sign papers that say I won't say certain things. I am caught between reaching out to those of us that are in the French word, it's banlieue, which is the outskirts, those that reside in the outskirts, and setting an example for all around me, as well as being, if I'm lucky, a mere 20% of my workforce, and a woman. I am a single woman. I have partnered with a woman. I have 2 children. I am a police officer. I ask that as I face my job and weigh what I'm required to do and what I must do ethically from the grassroots of our world, can you please comment? Because you're in the public arena. You're in the worldwide.
No, you're putting it very well. I mean, there are several ways of coming at it. One is that the gender inequality and the discrimination against women by no means is confined to other parts of the world. We feel it as deeply as the 20% you indicate.
Lucky.
Pardon?
Lucky if I'm 20%. When
All
I
right, if you're-
started, it was 11, and when I left that service, I think they went down to 10.4.
Well, you're not giving me great cause for optimism, but you are giving me great cause for fighting the good fight, which is important. And there is an alleged move. By the way, you use internationally to develop entire women police force units for all of the conflict areas. And it's beginning to happen. It's quite funny, quite interesting, and indeed, most of them are coming from Bangladesh and South Asia, and I should mention Ghana. And there is a sudden recognition that women in the police force have a very significant role to play, given the nature of society and what is visited upon women. And then on top of recognizing that, I've never personally agreed, but there's no way of doing anything about it. I've never personally agreed with the muzzles that are placed on civil servants and on police forces and on the right to speak publicly about what one sees. I'd love a government of whistleblowers. I mean, I just don't see the sense in forever containing what we know to be wrong by muzzling the people who want to identify the wrongs. And that in Canada includes so many scientists whom the federal government has decided cannot speak out about their areas of expertise. So I would just say don't lose heart. And as a single mom and a lesbian, that's also part of the great human rights struggle which the world is waging today. I mean, the organization I've mentioned more than once, AIDS Free World, we have 5 simultaneous major court cases going on in the Caribbean at the moment, in Jamaica, Trinidad, Belize, and a couple of other countries looming, all of them on LGBT issues. And I think there is a rising tide of concern. And indeed, in the United States and in Canada, there's much greater progressive instinct around these issues. Our older daughter is a lesbian, and we have watched with fascination as Elena's place in the world is more and more and more affirmed, as it should be, without being sullied by castigation for sexuality. So I say, this isn't much use to you, but I say hang in and keep fighting to the extent you can fight. And I think gradually things will change, but as I was saying to the other gentleman, these are societal changes. It takes time. I wish I could do better for you.
You did wonderful by offering me the opportunity simply to ask the question.
You're very
and put it
kind.
in front of others.
Thank you. Yes.
We have
Yes.
time for one last question, Stephen.
Okay. Kira says it's the last question. It had better be a good one, or you will. I mean, you're now really being tested.
Well, if I wasn't nervous before, I am now, for sure. I am the chair of the board for a very small Stratford-based charity here known as Change Her World. We are working very hard to address many of the issues that you've spoken of, particularly in terms of the education for girls and the gender equality issues. My question to you is, I and our charity, other small charities around Stratford that are doing wonderful work in some of these developing worlds. We have a very small budget. We don't have a lot of money for marketing, for raising issues. We have small staff. My question is, we can't invite you to come and be our spokesperson every time we need somebody.
I don't charge as much as Trudeau.
You would be our first choice then. My question is, how do we impact in our own local communities to raise the critical issues that are being addressed and to make people understand that lives need to be valued? We need money, we need resources, and we can't do it without support.
Right, right. There are perhaps three possible answers. One is that you live in a broad community, if you include the suburb of Kitchener-Waterloo. You live in a broad community with a lot of very, very informed and knowledgeable activist voices that are a 20 to 30 minute drive. And there's no reason in the world why some of them shouldn't be prevailed upon, women and men alike, out of Laurier or Waterloo to come and speak at a school or to a community gathering or to a church or to a trade union. Those things, or even to a Rotary, those things happen, and one tends not to call on the resources that are immediately available. And I think they are available. A number of names run through my mind of people who've had tremendous experience. The other thing is that there are a number of organizations around girls in particular that you might want to get in touch with and see whether they can give you some support, both administrative and maybe even some financial support. I think of organizations like CARE. I think of organizations like Save the Children. I think of organizations like Oxfam. Pardon? Oh, the Canadian Women's Foundation can be quite wonderful, no question about it. What they would be able to do, I don't know, but there is a particular focus now, especially on the education of girls. I mean, one of the things I didn't say in the course of my remarks is that this Millennium Development Goal of putting children who are eligible into primary school, the truth is that there are between 60 and 100 million children, the great majority of them girls, who are not in school today. And when it comes to secondary school, you're lucky if you get 12 to 15% of the student population as girls. And so the focus you have is an extremely good one. And I think there are these organizations that might well be able to help, and you can find them all on the internet. And finally, I don't know whether this is possible or not, but I think that the local area MPPs and the local area members of parliament do have access, not personally to funding, but to departments and ministries which provide funding for groups that can show a real authenticity and legitimacy. And it strikes me that you probably can. And that all the politics aside, one then sits down with area MPPs and says, you know, you've got a new premier and you're claiming to be beneficent and progressive, and here's an opportunity to show the community that you're serious about it. What might we expect? So I wouldn't give up. It is very. Okay, I sense that. And I also sense that you're not in the slightest nervous. But I'm glad you raised it, because it is tremendously important. If you want to shoot for the moon,
Yes.
with someone who does have money and has an all-girls school, you might want to drop a note to Oprah Winfrey.
I've tried that.
And tell Oprah Stephen was speaking at the. I say, in order to enhance and burnish my credibility with the audience, that I actually once took Oprah to Zambia. So when I remind her intensely who I am, she does remember. Okay. And you can say, I saw Stephen on the platform. He suggested I write to you and ask you for funding for our worthy cause, consistent with your girls' school in Johannesburg. Be my guest. Thank you, everyone.
I'll let you know how I make out. Thank you.
On behalf of Antoni and the whole audience here today, I'd like to thank Stephen so much for being with us. My name is Anita Gaffney, and I'm the festival's executive director. I'm so grateful for Stephen sharing his insight, his knowledge, and mostly his passion with us today. As Alora says in The Thrill, and as Stephen quoted today, we have a hell of a lot of work to do. He's done a masterful job of focusing our collective lens on those that have been marginalized. And he's done a masterful job with the topic, which I'm so flattered that this is the first time that he's taken up and spoken on a topic he's been assigned on disability, disillusion, and self-discovery. And the self-discovery for me today, I don't know if anybody else felt like this, but I felt like, gosh, what am I doing? I'm not doing enough. Oh, so one small thing we can do. Today, the address was live streamed on the web, and we've taped it. So we're going to have it available on our website, so please go and get it. But I will also make the commitment to email it to all of you this week, and I would encourage you to please share this address. More and more people need to take up the cause and be inspired by Stephen Lewis. Now, Stephen, he snuck away. I was going to say he can stay here today. We're doing a performance of Tommy, so as long as he's good with all kinds of stuff going on behind him, or if he can jump in and sing and dance, welcome to stay. I want to make a plug for a couple of other forum events that are coming up this weekend. Alex Bulmer, who's a wonderful artist, she's going to be speaking about the insight of blindness this afternoon at 5:30 at the University of Waterloo campus. Tomorrow morning, we have a panel discussion with some wonderful artistic directors, our own Antoni Cimolino, as well as Jackie Maxwell from the Shaw Festival, and Peter Hinton, who was the artistic director at the National Arts Centre. And then on Sunday night at 5:30, there's a panel discussion on the power of women and women in power. So you can see how all of these are all intermingling with one another, so we can continue the conversation throughout the weekend. So thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you to Stephen Lewis, and thank you to Peter Mansbridge today for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to you. Thank you so much.